When I moved to Victoria 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, in Victoria, BC, there wasn't a single immigrant in my building. Like, I didn't see a single, you know, so it's hard to connect with people when you first start. And coming from a culture, I can talk about my own experience where, you meet someone and they'll get your phone number, and then you're gonna go for a hike or something. Relationships here tend much longer to develop, even on the personal side.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to leave behind every single thing you know and start a new life in a foreign country? From my experience, it can be a struggle. On the Newcomers podcast, I'll be sharing my story as well as the stories of other immigrants. We'll be talking about the joys and struggles of starting afresh. My name is Dozier, and I'm looking forward to being your host. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Newcomers podcast. I'm pretty excited about today's episode. With me, I have Ingrid, who's been in Canada for 6 years now, and who's one of, how when you see people you look up to when you look at stuff they're doing, you're like, yeah, I want to be like this person someday. How's it going? Welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's been a while since I'm the interviewee from I interviewed person from a podcast, right? I'm usually on the other seat, so yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Yeah, that even makes it more exciting. So I'm just gonna kind of go. I I feel like I don't want to talk about all the usual settling in, finding a job, but I just want to talk to you about you run a business here, and I want to ask you a very direct question. What does it feel like being an immigrant founder? What's the difference between running a business here and if you have run a business in your own country? Like how?
It's very challenging. So I can tell you a bit of a backstory that will
Sure.
introduce the listeners to what I do. So I founded. There's a couple extenuating factors here. So I founded my company when I was 21. I was still doing my first bachelor's degree, and I was back in Brazil. Right. I work in a very male-dominated field, enterprise software with large companies. So in terms of cultural differences, Brazil has to have way more. Age matters way more. In Canada, it still matters, but it matters way more. And then you have the sexism that comes with it, and all that. Being a woman in tech, and right, we can get into it later because I have a lot of data on that aspect. I study a lot about it. But starting a company there was hard for a couple of factors. So when you look back 7 years ago, startup funding wasn't really a big thing in places like Brazil. Like if you went for VC, or they call themselves, they would want 50% of your company, right? They wouldn't want 51%. They would want control. Without that, also the investors would mock me because it's like, what's a young woman like you have to offer, right? I got laughed at. I got called intern at my first networking event because I went to say hi to someone from. Funny enough, it's my client. The
Oh,
company is my client now, a very large company, and he looks me up and I was like, "Who sent their intern to the event?" So those are extenuating factors that I went through in Brazil when I first started my business. So said that, when we decided to bring the business to Canada, I was already living here. I always say that we were working remote before it was cool. And it's challenging, but it's different kinds of challenge. But because of everything I went through in Brazil, it was kind of like I was beaten up enough that I was like, okay, we can deal with this, right? There's a couple of things that people don't usually think about when you think about starting a business in a new country. So where I worked in Brazil, I went to university there, and I had a bunch of university friends that went to work for the best companies that I had contacts with. I had people that I interned with or went. I worked at General Electric. I worked at SAP. I worked at Luxottica. So even if those people, it weren't those companies that were my clients, there were still people. There were connections, networking, right? You get here, and I always make the joke that when I got here, I knew no one to the point that my emergency contact was my Airbnb host.
oh, damn.
It's not like I didn't move with family. I was just like, no, I'm going, right? And one thing that I realized in Canada is that networking is even more important, right? The good thing is that people in the East Coast more than the West Coast, because I work with both and I see a difference there, and it's my opinion. they're more open for networking. But even in the
Where
West Coast,
on
yeah,
the
the
East
West
Coast?
Coast tends to be a little bit more clicky. The East Coast people are more open to networking, but then that I could see how, for example, I wanted to be part of an event, but I didn't even get invited for it. Like I didn't even know that the event happened. And when we first got to Latam Startups, which was the first acceleration program, and Miriam, like 3 years later, still help us to this day. Like their team is amazing. Was you have to have the context, right? So when you move here, you hear about the Canadian experience, but that's not only for people, that's for companies too. Like I work with very large enterprises that the South America team connected me with the North American team. And if they were in the America, it was fine. But if it was in Canada, they're like, well, but what Canadian companies do you have in your portfolio? Even though they've been working with us for 3 4 years.
Okay, that's funny.
Yeah. So within that, like the networking part is a piece. The finding your first Canadian client, I think, is super challenging, and that depends. Like again, my specialty is B2B. I know that for B2C there are pros and cons because people tend to be more open when there's lower risk, depending on what you're doing. But those are the two, I think, the two main factors. And the third one, which is something that I don't experience myself, but the companies that I mentor experience, is the language barrier. And not that they don't speak English, but there's research in this that people will think that you know less because you have a stronger accent, right? It can be adventurous in terms of if you're doing a presentation, actually people that have accents tend to hold the attention more because it sounds different. But at the same time, I could see that sometimes one of my founders was struggling to say something and the other person would dismiss them, and it's they know it well. They just didn't know the right words in English to articulate themselves, or they didn't sound confident enough in English.
Yeah,
Especially confidence in tech world, it seems to
yeah,
trump all these days.
it's the
So
theme.
exactly. So and especially tech founders, right? Like have technical founders. So I think those are the main topics that would come up for me.
Interesting. So I want to dig a bit into the part talked about networking. Like so one, how do you navigate that? But two, just kind of talk a bit more about the Canadian experience for companies. Because like that's I always assumed that it was just kind of experience for people who were trying to get a job, not even people who have a business trying to pitch.
Okay, so a couple of things. I have a friend that she told me she did this, and I didn't realize this was what I was doing. So Serena is an amazing entrepreneur in the U.S. She's American, but she she has an amazing story. But what she would always say is like, I was always there. I was always on the networking events, and that's what I did. I used so when we first started the company, it was just before the pandemic, and we went to Toronto for the Latam startups. But after that, everything was virtual. So I was in every single networking event you can possibly imagine. Someone wanted to connect with me, and I would connect with people later. So one networking event was like, "Hey, can we do a 15-minute chat to get to know each other?" And I would continuously doing that. The thing is, when people think about networking, they usually think about a transaction. I'll give you something and you're going to give me something. And I don't see it that way. There's amazing people that I connected with that had nothing to do with my industry, like lawyers in family law, but they connected me with other people that were super important. I tell you a story where it was like my first year, and I met he works in a accountant for consult like a large consulting firm in Vancouver, and he wanted to connect with me, and we connected, and he introduced me to this day one of my best mentors in tech. So he was a CTO at a very large company, and he lives in my city, and he introduced me to him. And I would have not never gotten that connection if I was like, oh, he's not in my field, I don't want to meet him, right? So I went to a point where I would apply for every single pitch competition. I would apply for every single like networking event. Like if he had to be applied, I was there. The good thing about it is that when I received no, I didn't even remember what I was being told no to. I was like, well, all right, like, one less. And when I received yes, the same thing. Like I remember one of the pivotal moments for us was when, I don't know if you heard about SAS North, but we got invited to pitch. And I was like, oh, wow, that sounds big. What's this event again? And then I went to look at it and realized that I was going to, because it was just the first in person events that were happening. and I was actually going to have to pitch on stage in front of like hundreds of people. And I was like, oh, that's what I applied for. All right, so I think for me is the networking part is being putting yourself out there to network. I think that a lot of cultures, we don't want to brag, right? I don't know how about your culture, but in my culture, you talking about the things that you've done is not really, it's like, oh, why are you saying this? But in Canada, it's different. People want to hear. It's like, okay, like, what are the things you've done? Like, what are the amazing things that I like to work with understanding the culture and seeing, and I'm not saying just assimilating, because I think assimilating is a dangerous thing where you might end up losing your own core self.
Gosh, I love that. And I'll ask you a question on that, but yeah, finish.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, you should assimilate. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that Canada brings a lot of immigrants for a reason, but also because people having different people that think in different ways is important, and it's important for technology. It's important for innovation. It's important for society, so people can have dialogue. Right. What I say about this is take things with compassion. Sometimes people will say things that for you sounds very wrong, and some people are just plain mean. But I say it's like, what's the perspective of the person that's on the other side of the table? Where do they come from? So I've dealt with, so in my consulting business, I dealt with companies that were having a very difficult time connecting their teams because their teams were people from everywhere, and I'm like, have you explained to them the differences in culture, that why they're having the communication problems? And as simple as 2 hours, they're like, oh, this person talks like that not because they're trying to be rude, but it's because of their culture. And that creates more compassion to the other, right? So I think open dialogue in terms of that is more important. You built and all that. um, and so dealing with that cultural change, because it feels wrong sometimes, and I talk to some founders, depending on their culture, that's like it's very challenging for them to just speak up about the amazing things that they've done. And the second thing is connecting with people. So more often than not, you get to networking events like, hi, my company does this, right?
Mhm.
And it's like, right, how many of those pitches have you heard? And it's just like sometimes I will connect in a networking event talking, if we're in the West Coast, usually talking either about the weather or talking about a nice hike or something like that, right? Or like if someone came from another city, connecting about different things that make people relax and rapport with you, right? You can talk about business, but in the end, is I like to ask more questions than I like to speak. So
Mhm.
whenever I go network, it's like, why did you get in this field in this first place? Like I'm genuinely curious about people, and I think that's something that really helps me in terms of the networking part. And you had a second question, but I don't remember what it was.
No, it was just basically like it was really about the Canadian experience thing. Like is it so obvious? Because it feels like for people who are just looking for jobs, like it's so obvious, like it hits you in the face. It seems to have gotten better in the
Yeah.
last few years. Looks like it has, but it still crops up. So just curious, like for businesses, do you get that same vibe, like just like an invisible wall just there holding
Yeah.
you back?
Yeah. They will say like, oh, who in Canada uses your software? Or which companies? Oh, but are they the Canadian part, or like is it the Canadian one, or is it because we work international companies, right? So it's pretty obvious. Yeah.
Mm, that is interesting to hear.
To the point of like, well, call me when you have a couple Canadian clients, and we'll test your
Oh
software.
wow.
Hmm.
Okay, so you mentioned something about, and I want to explore that. You talked about cultural if influence on how people approach businesses. I just want to talk a bit about that. Like, what are your thoughts on, like how you said, in my culture, yeah, we do brag a bit, but again, also I think also there's just the balance between, even if your culture has confidence, when you move to a new place, then there's trying to adjust into with all the norms of the new place and all that, which literally hits you down in a way that you have to kind of start from the bottom again. And then I'm not even as you were talking, I was not wondering, for cultures where they don't even brag, like how do they even handle all that? Like just moving across that confidence ladder to the point where you can now finally talk about what you do.
So there's a couple of things. I want to start with one thing that I always use, even if I'm working with a new mentee or a company from another country and all that, is the Hofstad analysis. The Hofstad analysis has
Yeah.
five, if I'm not mistaken, five different.
Power indexes or something.
Yeah, I forgot the name, but different analysis that it does in terms of the country's culture. I just like to preempt that with saying that it's a very westernized view of the countries, because the way that they speak about countries is a westernized view. But when you look, I'm going to talk specifically about high context and low context cultures, right? Because and individualism and collectivism. So when you look about high context cultures like Brazil, for example, we're not that high, but we're high enough. Uh, when you go to business meetings, you bring a presentation and you talk about all the, like, the mission, the values, and everything like that. If you try to do that in Canada, people are going to die of boredom. Like, they don't want to hear that. They want to know what you're doing and why do I care, right? So when you talk about that, when you ask about like building confidence, I think that comes in a couple ways. I think people need to be seen, and it's not only their fault, because I think that I love living in Canada. I don't want to leave. I find this country amazing. But I do think we sell it, even for entrepreneurs. It's like, oh, this is a Canadian dream. This is going to be amazing. It's super multicultural and everything is going to be great. And it's not how it works, right? You still have to adapt to a new country. And I think that in a lot of ways, people end up feeling that bias that happens because you're immigrant, and that can add to bias regarding race, bias regarding a bunch of other things, right? So in the confidence aspect, what I always talk to my mentees is do one step at a time. So the first thing is remembering that even though not everyone in this country thinks that your experience is valuable just because it was from Brazil or because it was from South Africa, Canada is not the center of the world. And North Americans tend to think that, right? So remembering that, yes, the work that you did in your home country was important and it was a big deal. And not letting, just because you don't have a Canadian experience, let that beat you down. And I say that to entrepreneurs, but I also say that to people that are looking for jobs. And I know it's easier said than done,
Yeah.
because when you receive a bunch of no's, right, that's much more challenging. um, and I would say that finding people that are, so one thing that I strongly advise is for entrepreneurs to find people that are on similar stages as they are as entrepreneurs. You can have mentors, and I do have a lot of mentors, but people that you can just vent to, like, this happened to me, or like, I went to this meeting and this happened. And that's what's so important about connecting with other immigrants as well, because sometimes, like, my partner is Canadian, sometimes he doesn't really get what I'm trying to say about things that frustrate me, right? For him, it's just like, like,
Yeah.
it's just, he tries to be compassionate about it, but he does sometimes doesn't understand. So having people that are immigrants as well and have somewhat of the same experiences as you helps you being like, okay, I'm not alone in this. Like, I am not the problem, right?
Yeah.
I would say, in terms of the last thing I would say about the confidence part is, I like to work with understanding the culture and seeing, and I'm not saying just assimilating, because I think assimilating is a dangerous thing where you might end up losing your own core self.
Gosh, I love that. And I'll ask you a question on that, but yeah, finish.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, you should assimilate. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that Canada brings a lot of immigrants for a reason, but also because people having different people that think in different ways is important. And it's important for technology, it's important for innovation, it's important for society, so people can have dialogue, right? What I say about this is take things with compassion. Sometimes people will say things that for you sounds very wrong, and some people are just plain mean. But I say, it's like, what's the perspective of the person that's on the other side of the table? Where do they come from? So I've dealt with, so in my consulting business, I dealt with companies that were having a very difficult time connecting their teams, because their teams were people from everywhere. And I'm like, have you explained to them the differences in culture? that why they're having the communication problems. And as simple as 2 hours, they're like, oh, this person talks like that, not because they're trying to be rude, but it's because of their culture. And that creates more compassion to the other, right? So I think open dialogue in terms of that is more important.
I like that. Like I don't even know where to start right now. Like you've opened up a lot of parts in my head, but here, I think the first one basically is just talking about what you said about assimilation. You and just kind of extending on that unique viewpoints and how that shows up, because then everyone says to you as an immigrant, like when you come, like, oh yeah, take in the culture, just assimilate it all. I'm like, are you going to lose yourself in the process? Like there's this thing, there's this saying we have back home in Nigeria: you don't throw away the baby with the bathwater, you throw away the bathwater and you keep the baby. you know and I feel like that's like a good way to think about this assimilation thing. Like, yeah, assimilate, take as much as you can from the culture, but I feel like the most powerful thing of you being an immigrant is the ability to take some things from that culture, take stuff from yours, and merge it together and create something new. you know and so I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that. I mean, where I've said it all.
No, I think that's it. Like, I think that there is the people say it's like, oh, you should just like take in the new culture. But I think we would all be much more boring as a society if everyone sounded the same and looked the same and talked the same, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there is a lot of judgment still in terms of like, yeah, like you immigrate and it can be Canada or other place, but like you're just gonna assimilate, and I am not a proponent to that. I think you could take in the culture and respect the cultural values of a new place at the same time as applying your own culture to it, depending on the situation that you are, of course, because it's, again, it's easy for me to say in a position of privilege where I have my own company and I dictate what I do, well, like there's immigrants that like, or even like refugees that you just have to get whatever job they can get, right? So that's just my warning there. Just like, but
Mm,
as much as you
mm,
can, not letting that persuade you away from your culture and your values, because that's important too.
yeah. And then the other follow-up question I had for you was, so when you talk about the high context, low context cultures, how do you think it shows up? And if you think about your own personal life, your own personal experience immigrating, how do you think it shows up not just in work, but in other parts of life, in the process of trying to settle into a new country as an immigrant? Like, how do you think it should affect? Or
So there's a couple things. One of the things that it shows up, and it's the high context, low context. I think collectivism and individualism also play
Mhm.
a role, because Canada, the US, those countries are very individualistic. And now I can talk from the perspective of I work with a lot of people from South America, and I work with a lot of people from like Asia and some countries in Africa. So, like, there's, I'm not talking about European immigrants here, basically. But I think that in terms of the like when you first get here, it can be very lonely. I think that it, and then that depends on where you immigrate. Like if you immigrate somewhere like Toronto, you used to have a lot of immigrants, people tend to be more open. But like when I moved to Victoria 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, in Victoria, BC, there wasn't a single immigrant in my building. Like I didn't see a single, like, you know. So it's hard to connect with people when you first start. And coming from a culture, I can talk about my own experience where, like, you meet someone and they'll get your phone number, and then like you're gonna like go for a hike or something. Relationships here tend much longer to develop, even on the personal side. I've heard from more immigrants than others, like, I don't have any Canadian friends. It's so hard because like they were born and raised here, they have their own group of friends and they're fine with that. Brazilians, we tend to be more open. We have multiple types of friends and multiple groups and all that, right? So it's a difference in culture that can be very lonely depending on where you move. Again, if you're in Toronto, I'm not saying it's much easier, but what I'm saying is you have more immigrants and that ends up like creating more connections for you. Um, but it's just a different kind of relationship. The other thing is, like, in terms of the collectivism and individualistic culture, when you look at your personal side, it's I'll tell you a story because it's funny. Like, I have a Brazilian couple that lives on the same apartment club complex as me, and we became super good friends. They're Brazilian. I go there all the time to drink coffee and all of that. And when I was in Toronto for work, my partner broke his clavicle. And again, my partner is Canadian, right? And I was like, oh, my friend is coming to pick up the dog, so you don't have to walk her. He's like, what do you mean she's just coming to pick up the dog? I was like, yeah, I asked her to pick up the dog, so you don't have to take care of the dog. But like for him, those like me leaving a key
Mm,
with her for her to watch her dog for a couple of, it's just like it's harder for him to understand because we're much more, I don't want to say supportive, but we're like, I have a lot of Canadian friends as well, but I feel like my relationship with my friends from other cultures tend to be closer. And there's a difference there in terms of the collectivism and individualism, where like I know that if I have to call my Brazilian friend, call another Brazilian friend, call me, is like, hey, can you help me move? I was like, yeah, right now, yeah. For them it has to have a little bit more I was like, in 2 weeks, right? So I think those things are hard to navigate because sometimes people would say, let's say you start meeting someone like as a friend, and then they don't call you or they don't ask you for your numbers, like, did I do something wrong? Like, is it me? Right? When it's just the way that they relate to people and it takes a while for them to warm up. So I think that part of relationships is challenging in business, but also in the personal life when you first move, especially if you don't move with family, because then you don't really have that support system at home, right?
yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see that happen. And I like how you put it because one thing I've seen or one thing I've heard a lot of people say on the interview when I talk to them is basically that thing about people find that they make more friends with immigrants than with Canadians. So the Canadians usually casual friends or but most of the friends, like, I look at my circle and most of the friends I have are mostly immigrants, like almost all of them. Immigrants from different parts, Bosnia, Zambia, Nigeria, like scattered all over, but they're mostly immigrants. Like I rarely have a Canadian. I don't think I have a Canadian friend. That I feel sad about that actually. Now that you put it that way. And that thing you said about just calling up, back in Nigeria, we used to make a joke that back in Nigeria, people would just show up at your house. Like you just knock on the door and then you open it like, hi, how's it going?
Yeah.
But here we now move here and then you're like, you want to go to your friend's house. You're like, maybe I should tell them I'm coming because like I mean we're in Canada now and it's a different country, a different culture, and you don't know if the person has assimilated all that and it's like, no, why didn't you tell me you're coming? Because I had other things to do with my life.
Yeah.
You know.
It's funny you mentioned that because first time that we hosted Brazilian friends, so Canadians, they get there on time and they leave like on time, right? And then my partner was like, they never leave. I was like, he was like, no, they don't. They'll stay here. They'll drink beer. Like you can go to sleep if you want. They'll continue. They'll keep
Exactly.
going, right? You host, you're like, they might sleep on your sofa. Like it's fine, but it's that difference in culture, right?
Yeah, so I think we'll round up now, but I want to just ask you a couple of questions, which is basically, when was the first time it hit you that you weren't home?
What was that? Sorry.
When was the first time it hit you that you weren't home? Like you're not home, you've moved out of your home country.
I think it was when I got to my Airbnb. When I moved here, I actually rented just a room in someone else's house, and I'm a much I don't seem like it, but I'm very introverted. So like being someone else's house with them there and all their hosts and all that, like really hit me. I was like, "Eesh," like and just like not having credit score to rent an apartment and trying to find an apartment to rent, right? Not being able to get a phone line, a postpaid phone line. I think those are things that it really hit me. I was like, oh, okay, like this is different. And I had traveled much. I traveled a lot before then, but it's like, okay, this is my life now. Like this is where I'm creating my roots, right?
Yeah. Staying on that a bit, what are your thoughts on the fact that it feels like when you see people say, yeah, I travel, but it feels like traveling as a tourist and traveling to live in a country like are two different experiences. Like
Yeah.
they leave you with different feelings.
So even when I lived in New Zealand for a year, but I knew there was a time limit, right? When I moved here, I was like, okay, this is it. Like I'm gonna live here. Like, and it feels different. Everything feels different, right?
And I think the last question I have for you is basically what has been your most overwhelming moment so far, like in your journey in Canada so far?
Overwhelming. I think it was doing the pitch in person at SAS North in Ottawa. It was just after the pandemic. I was doing all the pitches online to the coziness of my home. And I had to pitch on stage twice because we end up winning the pitch competition. So you pitch on the first day, and then if you pass, you do the second time. But for me, it was like I already spoke English, all that, but like speaking on a big stage with hundreds of people in front of me and sharing about my company that, like, we were, no one knew us in Canada. I think that was very overwhelming in a good way, and I received a lot of good feedback, but it was just a moment I was like, oh wow, look how far, like I didn't know anyone here, right? And now I'm doing this, so like look how far I've come. So I think that was an important moment for me.
Awesome. Awesome. Like, thank you so much. Like, this has been really good talking to you about, especially the part about the business. Like, and thank you for the lessons. The part about networking. I mean, I think people know that, but we just kind of get caught up in the fact that we need to make money, and then we just, just hit. You know.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
but thank you so much, and thank you for coming on the pod.